Hey, biology students. We're starting a new lecture unit now, and so the next few lectures, we will be describing pathogenic bacteria. In this lecture video, we start by describing the interactions that we have with microbes in general, and we look at three particular types of host-microbe interactions. Let's take a look. So in discussing this, we refer to the human body as the host. So the host would be your body, or the body, human body. And then, of course, our microbes could be a variety of different things, but in this new lecture series, we really are focusing on bacteria, although there is a lot of crossover with other types of microbes. So in this first type of relationship, we refer to our relationship with bacteria as mutualistic or mutualism. And what that means is that both the host and the microbes benefit from the relationship. So there's benefits on both sides. Primarily what we're talking about here are the microbiome bacteria, the bacteria that make up the trillions of cells of bacteria that reside inside of our bodies. So we call this the microbiome. Sometimes it's referred to as microflora. And in this picture, we're actually looking at the gut microbiome, okay? And a specific example of a mutualistic bacteria might be E. coli. That's part of the gut microbiome. And what's it doing in there? Well, it's got a number of different jobs that we benefit from. It actually makes vitamins, okay? So it actually makes vitamin K, which is really important in blood clotting, and that's where we get it. We get it from the E. coli bacteria. It helps with food digestion. So there's certain foods that our bodies don't have the enzymes to digest, like fiber, for example. And so the E. coli help in the digestion of certain types of foods. Of course, they benefit from that too because they get ATP from the digestion of some of our food molecules. The E. coli are also important because they outcompete pathogens for space, pathogens being the disease-causing microorganisms. Recall we've discussed the microbiome before in this class, and I told you the analogy I like is that the microbiome is like a garden. So if you think about having a really beautiful garden with lots of flowers and roses and all sorts of beautiful things, that's like your microbiome. It's really, really beneficial to have a healthy garden of these bacteria, primarily in your gut, but they also reside in other parts of the body as well. And the reason is that if you have a healthy garden, well, and there's no space, the weeds can't grow. And the weeds are like the pathogens. So the pathogen, the disease-causing bacteria we want to keep out of our bodies, well, that is facilitated by having a healthy microbiome. Okay, so lots of benefits we get. Now this, if you want to follow the link here that I provided on this slide, this actually describes a recent study from 2019 where they found that actually some of your bacteria in your gut actually can produce neurotransmitters. Isn't that amazing? They produce the neurotransmitters in the gut. Now, of course, we make neurotransmitters as well, but they can produce neurotransmitters that can actually affect your mood. So depending on what bacteria you have that reside in your gut, those neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine, can affect your mood. Are you have a positive mood or a negative mood, a depressed mood? That might actually be a result of what bacteria are living in your gut, believe it or not. And that's because there's actually a very powerful nerve called the vagus nerve that connects your gut to your brain. And that's actually where that connection would happen. The second type of relationship that we have with our microbes, we call a commensal relationship or commensalism. Now, you remember in the beginning of the semester, I would frequently bring my giant microbes plush toys into lecture class. I have a personal collection of many of these microbes, and now I have to put them on my slides so that we can look at how cute they are and how they help us understand certain concepts. So you've actually seen this one under the microscope. Remember back in the old days when you would look through microscopes in a laboratory? So recall these guys actually look like clusters of purple grapes under the microscope, and that's because they're gram-positive cocci that form clusters that we call staphylococci. So this is actually our garden variety, normal part of your microflora, Staphylococcus. And this is actually Staphylococcus epidermidis, which we find on probably greater than 95% of the skin microbiome. It is what we would call a commensal. Okay, it would be called a commensal bacteria. And what we mean by that is when we consider the relationship that we have with Staph epidermidis, we would say again that the bacteria benefits. They live on the skin. They want to live there. They benefit from living there and feeding off of actually dead skin cells. But the host may have a more minimal benefit, but the big thing is that the host isn't really harmed from having this commensal bacteria that resides on the skin. And that's what we mean by commensal. Really no huge benefit. It might be, again, outcompeting pathogenic bacteria on the skin, and that is one explanation for why we have so much Staphylococcus epidermidis and why we've co-evolved with this particular species. But in general, they're not pathogenic. So the third relationship is in fact where we get that parasitic or pathogenic relationship. And here we now see another version of Staphylococcus. Do you remember this one? This one comes with a little cape because he is a superbug. What does that mean? Well, it means that he's resistant to the antibiotic methicillin. So remember, we've actually studied this a little bit when we talked about antibiotics. MRSA, sometimes called MRSA, which stands for methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So still in the genus Staphylococcus, it is a cousin of Staphylococcus epidermidis. And what's the difference? Well, this one has a virulence trait, okay? It has a very specific characteristic. It is methicillin resistant, so it has an antibiotic resistance gene. And this allows it, with other types of special genes it has as well, to cause diseases, and primarily diseases of the skin. So this poor woman, she had MRSA, and she had to have a skin graft because the MRSA actually ate away at her skin. And so you can have very severe infections related to MRSA, and people can actually die from MRSA. So in this relationship, when we consider the host and the microbe still benefits. It's getting benefits from feeding on the host, but the host obviously is harmed. It's in a parasitic relationship with that bacteria, and that's a harmful one. I do want to mention something these are some terms that you're going to see show up today. And I'm just going to go ahead and give you the definitions so you can put those into your notes. The term pathogen refers to a microbe that is parasitic with its host and causes infection and disease. And the pathogenesis term that we're using in the title of today's video, this refers to a disease caused by a specific pathogen in that course of the disease and specific symptoms and signs of that infection. You're going to hear me use the word virulence, which refers to the relative severity of the disease caused by that microorganism. And you're going to hear me use this word virulence factor, which basically means anything, any characteristic, any trait of that microbe, including toxins, as well as other physical characteristics that we learned about in the beginning of the semester. Remember, there's certain features of bacteria that allow them to establish disease in their host. So this could be something like having a capsule, so they're able to hide from the phagocytes using the capsule. This could be the fimbriae, those little sticky hair-like structures that some bacteria have for attachment. This could be flagella for swimming within the body. This could be toxins. We're going to talk about toxins a little bit later in today's lecture. This could be spores. This could be antibiotic resistance, like MRSA has antibiotic resistance. Maybe beta-lactamase, that enzyme that allows the bacteria to digest the beta-lactam antibiotics. And there's more to this list. This isn't a complete list, but this gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here when we're talking about a virulence factor. So something to consider when we look at these different relationships we have with our microbes, and that we do have these commensal or mutualistic bacteria, and then we have these pathogenic bacteria. There's something to consider though, which is that it is possible for our commensal or mutualistic bacteria to become a pathogen. So we could take our harmless garden variety Staphylococcus epidermidis, shown in blue, and we could have a transformation occur where he actually becomes the MRSA bacteria. How does that happen and why does that happen? Well, if you remember, when we studied the genetics of microbes, we learned that many bacteria can acquire a virulence trait through horizontal gene transfer. So this could occur through, remember, either transformation we studied, where the bacteria can take up foreign DNA from its environment, or it could be direct transfer through conjugation. And these are features of what we learned about in genetics called horizontal gene transfer. So the idea that virulence genes can be passed from one cell, bacterial cell, to another. Second reason why we could get a harmless commensal or mutualistic becoming a pathogen, well, the bacteria is accidentally introduced into a different body site. A good example of this is actually going back to our classic mutualist, which is E. coli. We have billions of E. coli in our large intestine. Actually, the majority of your feces is actually E. coli cells. And remember, we want them there. We want them there for the vitamins they produce, for the digestive assistance they provide. So we do want those E. coli there. But you know where we don't want them? We don't want them in the bladder. And so what happens is if E. coli, which is primarily a fecal bacteria, actually is introduced into the urethra, okay, accidentally going into the urethra, that can lead to a urinary tract infection, a UTI forming. And that's because this is a different body site. But now E. coli is a pathogen, isn't it? It's become it's causing an infectious disease. When it's normally in the large intestine, we call it a good bacteria, quote unquote. But you put it in the wrong place. It's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, there you go. Now you're giving it an opportunity to establish disease in the host. So on one side of the story, it has to do with the bacteria, but also a lot of this equation comes down to what's happening in our host, what's happening in our human body. So if the immune status of that host changes, that can cause a harmless commensal or mutualistic bacteria to actually get another opportunity here to become a pathogen. And so what do I mean by that? Well, you hear this term a lot related to immune status. It's called being immunocompromised. Somebody who is immunocompromised has a weakened immune system. And this can be a result of a number of different reasons. This could be that we have, this is related to age. So as we age, our immune system is not as well equipped to deal with infection. It's also harder to heal. This may also be an effect of pre-existing or health conditions such as diabetes. So if somebody develops diabetes or hypertension or obesity, even pregnancy weakens the immune system. And so all of those sorts of factors, let's say maybe another one might be somebody's recovering from maybe surgery or another infection. So recovering from surgery or other infections where they're in a weakened state. So all of those and more could lead to an immunocompromised state. And fourth, the ecology of the body's microbiome is altered. So sometimes people can be on long-term antibiotic use, and that can alter the body's microbiome. So long-term antibiotic use is associated with an increase in yeast infections, and that's because you wipe out the bacteria in your body, the microbiome, the microflora with an antibiotic use. And so that would cause the yeast to increase. So we would see an increase in yeast infections. We would also see an increase in other types of bacterial infections are associated with long-term antibiotic use, like Clostridium difficile, or what's called C. diff. That's also associated with overuse of antibiotics. So it's this delicate balance. You may be hearing in the news this concept of immunocompromised related to patients with COVID-19, who's getting sick and who's not, because it's a balance. If that scale tips in favor of the pathogen, now we have a disease scenario. Somebody was asking me in one of our recent Zoom calls if the company that makes these giant microbes, if they have actually made a COVID-19 plush toy. And I looked it up, and lo and behold, they have. So I had to plug it in here, even though this lecture is about bacteria. But, we keep inserting information about COVID-19 into the lecture here because it's so relevant, isn't it? It's so relevant to everything we're talking about, from how the immune system works, to infection and disease, to epidemiology, to vaccines, to drug targets. Medical microbiology has never been more relevant than it is right now in our world. So here it is. For all the harm it's causing, boy, doesn't it look cute, though, with all these little spike proteins. And of course, this is why it gets its name, coronavirus. Corona means crown. And so it has this crown of spike proteins. So what this picture is showing you is that it is this balance that's occurring constantly, even if you're not aware of it. What we're exposed to, the pathogens that are in our environment, the quantity of those pathogens, and how they're being introduced into your body is on one side of the scale. And then on the other side of the scale is your body and your immune system and your age and your health status, all of that playing a role. And actually, right now, this is a little girl. So, pediatric COVID-19 is actually looking very mild right now. Um, that might change as more information becomes available, but right now it's looking like pediatric or children are not becoming as seriously ill with COVID-19. And we don't entirely know why right now. There's some hypotheses about it. And one of those hypotheses involves the immune response. And so one of the things we know is that, and we've talked about in the immune system lecture, is that it's the inflammatory response that is actually doing in the patients with COVID-19, because that immune system, it has sort of a double-edged sword to it where it's there to help you, but it can get overstimulated by infections. And it does with COVID-19, where we talked about some of the interleukin signaling that is overexpressed in the alveoli. And then we get massive inflammatory response in the lungs, where the lungs fill with fluid. And then, unfortunately, the patients are struggling to breathe. And one of the things we know is that children don't seem to have this powerful and inflammatory response, especially young children like under age 10. And that might be an explanation for why pediatric COVID-19, somebody exposed to the exact same virus who is let's say 8 years old, and somebody who is 65 years old, same virus, same pathogen, but the host factors are different. Now the scale is of course going to tip towards the pathogen, right? So there's lots of things that go into why some people become sick and others do not.